Mishra needs no introduction. He wears multiple hats these days. Apart from being chief economist, he was an equity strategist earlier, so he's conversant with both the equity markets as well as the economy. He advises the Prime Minister. He is chairman of the Unique Identification Authority of India. Thanks for taking out time, Mr. Mishra. So, let me start by asking you, you would have already guessed where I'm heading with this. This is about the chaos which has been unleashed by the new US president. Of course, it's very hard to predict which way things are going to go. But how does one deal with this level of chaos and uncertainty, when you are analyzing things?
Yeah, so yeah. So, see, underneath this chaos now, I think we've seen the chaos long enough for us to start to look at patterns. So, as I see it, there are three major objectives. Now, how these objectives manifest themselves over what period of time will tell. But you can see that the Trump administration is trying to solve for one, we don't want to sacrifice any of American interests for multilateral issues. So now you must have seen, so they stepped out of WHO on day one, but now they've stepped out of funding the WTO. The US is no longer interested in giving defense for free. So I'm sure there'll be some hard asks from Korea, from Japan, like Germany, Saudi Arabia. So all of them, I think there will be bilateral discussions. So they do not, and similarly, on the trade side, they don't want to have, take the market leadership in saying 0% duties for me, and you open up as much as you would like. So this is clearly an objective that we do, and that is why we should get used to more bilateral deals, not just with the US, but across the world, because multilateralism that we've all been used to is getting over. So if things have been chaotic, just wait and see. I think they will get a lot more chaotic before they start to settle down. The second objective is what we could read in Stephen Miran's November 24 paper, where he talks about the costs of being the global reserve currency, that our currency is persistently overvalued. And frankly, just like, the Triffin dilemma that led to Nixon breaking the gold standard in the early 70s, now we have reached a stage where if you want to be the global reserve currency, you need to keep having a current account deficit, which means that your net international liabilities continue to rise faster than your international assets. As of now, the US is a net debtor of $18 trillion, 60% of GDP. Now, this is not sustainable. At some point, it had to break. And now what they're saying is that, look, guys, we want a weaker dollar. I don't think they're saying that we don't want to be the reserve currency of the world, but that's inevitable, and that's going to change as well. The third thing that they want to do, and this sounds illogical to everyone because we are so used to having income tax as the primary source of tax revenues, is that they want to generate revenues out of tariffs. So they're saying that between 1866 and 1913, 50% of US federal revenues came from import tariffs. And they're saying that, look, we got only $80 billion last year. Remember, the federal revenues are about $5 trillion. We got only about $80 billion last year. We can generate $300 billion extra, and we can give $400 billion of tax cuts. So the US consumer is such a powerful pool that we can generate, because everyone who wants to tap into it, pay a hafta and sort of, it's an import tariff. So these are the three major objectives. And I think all of them and you can understand why his team believes in them. And they're going to act on it. And I don't think 2nd of April, which most people in the market seem to think is like an end date, as if, there is a certain tariff rate that you adjust to and say, move on, life goes on. It's the start date. Because the moment multilateralism ends, everything else starts. Because look at export subsidies. You know, the World Trade Organization, the fear of the World Trade Organization was why people didn't have export subsidies. Now, everyone will have export subsidies. If China, for example, if already at 20% import duties, if the Venezuela tax starts to get added, 45% import duties, what do you think happens in China? They start dumping into Indonesia, Malaysia, India. We start raising tariff barriers. They start devaluing their currency. Look at what happened from 1930 to 1936, and you will see a pattern of what can happen. So I think this is the start of a period, a prolonged period of uncertainty, but the broad direction of travel is based on these three parameters.
So what do you think is going to happen to trade? I mean, bilateral, we'll see more bilateral treaties. India, for example, is negotiating with the US. There is a UK FTA in the works. There is a EU FTA in the works. But what patterns in trade do you see emerging?
See, the first thing is that when you have bilateral agreements, that's a suboptimal solution because you're trying to maximize through a lot of local optima, whereas a global optima is definitely superior. When you see the parameters of the India-US trade agreement, it's clearly that India would like to see better access to the US apparel markets because one of the biggest disadvantages India has had versus a Bangladesh and a Vietnam is that we didn't have an FTA with Europe, UK, or the US. And the fact that the US is kind of cracking the whip and forcing us to cut duties means that a lot of the Indian lobby groups which were preventing the FTA from getting signed earlier now have to stand by the wayside. So indirectly, it actually may be even better for us because, and this is again something that I'm surprised more people don't talk about. See, trade works through, the impact of trade on growth is through the channel of productivity, not end demand. You know, today we are give or take a $4 trillion economy. At some point, if you're bullish, 15 years, bearish, 30 years, we will be a $20 trillion economy. So we are going to add about $16 trillion of GDP. I think it is very reasonable to expect that not more than 1 trillion of that 16 trillion will come from net exports, change in net exports. Even today, China, which is the biggest and the most distortionist manufacturer the world has ever seen, their goods trade surplus is $1 trillion. So as we think about the world and as we think about trade openness, we have to realize that if you have an open trade and lower duties, your manufacturers are forced to become a lot more productive and efficient. And so to tap into export markets and to resist competition from abroad. So there are areas where we need strategic competitiveness, but there are many sectors where our manufacturers have had a sufficient level of protection for a long enough time that if they were exposed to competition from abroad, some of them should be able to thrive and improve themselves. So all in all, I expect that better access to the apparel, footwear markets of the US, and there is not too much of a threat of US imports coming in except for maybe some agri-commodities and a few others. So therefore, net-net, we may not be that badly off.
But exports as an engine of growth is something you're not a big believer in.
That's something that I think is very misleading. See, if you are a Thailand or a Malaysia or a Taiwan or even a Korea is slightly bigger, you can rely on exports as an engine for growth because that's where you rely on end demand abroad. When you are an economy the size of China or India, net exports, maybe for a temporary period, this is what happened to China between, say, 2000 and 2008, can be a driver of growth and initial spurt in income which drives consumption, etc. But on a sustainable level, we have to tap into our domestic demand. So as I said, trade openness works only through the productivity channel. So the more we open, the more productive we become. So TFP, total factor productivity, goes up. When we are thinking of end demand, we have to rely on internal demand. Even today, China, 19 trillion out of 20 trillion is domestic demand.
Speaking of growth, GDP has slowed in the last 6, 7 quarters from what, nearly 9% to around 6.5%. Now this slowdown happened even before, okay, anyway, you're discounting exports, but where do you see the economy headed? Do you think we need a rate cut, for example, to reverse this slowdown?
So there were, so one, I believe that this is a cyclical slowdown, not a structural one. So there are people who were earlier gung-ho about 7.5%, 8% growth and now saying, oh no, 6% is a structural growth. I disagree. I was at, even when very senior people were talking about 8% growth, I was saying, no, 7 se zyada, it's very hard to do more than 7. And even today, I think that 7 is our structural growth, and this is a cyclical growth slowdown. There were 3 cyclical factors that went against us in the last year. The first was fiscal. And on fiscal, my interpretation is actually very different from what I hear in the press and from some other economists. That the government was supporting growth so far and it's no longer in a position to support growth. Facts are exactly the opposite. So what economic theory says, and that's actually quite true, is that if your fiscal deficit shrinks, it is a drag on growth. If your fiscal deficit expands, it is a boost to growth. So there are 2 parts to the fiscal story. The first is that the government has gone from 6.9 to 6.4 in FY23 to 5.6 in FY24 to 4.8 in FY25. 50 basis points, 80 basis points, 80 basis points. It seeks to do only 40 basis points in the next year. So the headwind to growth from the planned fiscal consolidation of the central government are actually receding. So it is supportive of growth, right? It's a negative of negative. The second aspect of fiscal was that spending in FY24 was front-loaded. Spending in FY25 is back-loaded. So there was an 8-10 month period for various reasons that government spending was no longer supportive of growth. And that phase is also over. So basically we are seeing very rapid spending growth in the last 3 months of the year. So it is now reasonably clear to me that fiscal was a big drag. It is going to be less of a drag going forward. The second was regulatory. So I think for a variety of reasons, all regulators, financial regulators, even the government folks, they started to, I think, 1, take growth for granted. 2, perhaps became very worried that bubbles will form and it will create a lot of problems. And when growth is very rapid, things change and people are uncomfortable with change. And therefore, they started slowing down the process. So more and more circulars issued, more decisions taken which need a lot of interpretation, more warnings issued, and so on and so forth. But as we are seeing with a new set of regulators in place and sufficient amount of concern that growth is slowing down, we are saying that the regulators themselves are saying, you know what, we need to balance safety and efficiency. And therefore, because safety comes at a cost, and so we need to look at the cost that is coming to that growth. And so regulatory headwinds are easing. Coming to the monetary side. I don't think rate cuts are going to be very effective right now. So
Liquidity being very
yes. So India currently, and I think this is because the RBI kept liquidity too tight for too long, and I don't know if they were deliberate about it or they just thought that it was not their problem. The gap between the actual cost of funding and the theoretical cost of funding, if you remember the 2008-9 crisis, there used to be this FRA-OIS spread. It's the forward rates agreement, basically the funded rate, and the OIS is the actual theoretical rate. We used to track the spread to understand what was the stress in the financial system. Because if banks and financial firms are exchanging funds at a very high spread, which means that they don't trust each other. Today, in India, the FRA-OIS spread for the 12-month period is like 150 basis points. Now, it is starting to fall with the seasonality, but it is a ridiculously tight situation. So the 3-month CD rate from February to middle of March actually went up despite the rate cut. So for the economy to be supported by higher credit growth, you need to first bring down this spread. So you need to ease liquidity. And not just ease liquidity, but give comfort to the financial system that you mean it this time. And I think a lot has been done, and the governor has actually taken a lot of steps to OMOs, buy-sell swaps, whatever. Durable liquidity, which used to be 2% in September, had dipped to 0, actually negative for a while because of the currency interventions. But now they're up to about 1% of deposits. I think they need to take it to 2, that's my view, it could be wrong. They need to take it to 2% of deposits again. And then I think with a lag of 3 to 6 months, you can see banks becoming comfortable growing their loan book. And once that happens, the only conditionality is now how bad the global situation is, because the global situation will get much worse. But for domestic reasons, I think growth should get back to the 6.5–7% range.
Fair enough. So you were talking about regulators, passing a lot of orders. Recently, I read you saying that India should also have a Department of Government Efficiency. Okay, maybe not without a Musk-like person heading it, but even the economic survey and the budget were talking about deregulation. How big can it be as a driver of growth?
No, it can be a very significant driver of growth. So deregulation in general, and in fact the government is working on it. So they're going to set up a committee which will look at all the unnecessary rules and regulations. See, we are actually, the fact that the government moves much slower than what you and I would expect and would desire is the reason we grow at 7 and not 10%, right? But there has been action. There has been a significant easing of regulation. If you look back what the things that used to happen 10 years back and the things that happen today, the pace at which government decision making happens, I think there has been a significant improvement. There is a long, long way to go in terms of the administration of direct taxes, the administration of indirect taxes. Someone was tweeting about how the Department of Metrology, something which is absolutely ridiculous, but they will come and, harass. Now, these are things that distract entrepreneurs, small business. And as Anant very rightly writes in the economic survey, it hurts the medium, the MSMEs much more than the larger firms. And therefore, I think that deregulation is important. But when I talk about government efficiency, I'm not talking about a department of government efficiency. Frankly, our state is too small to be whittled down like that. In fact, I would think that the government should be bigger in the right places. It is, I think, right now big in the wrong places. But what I do think is that we have too many departments. Like, why do you need a ministry of coal, a ministry of oil and gas, a ministry of power, a ministry of new and renewable energy, and the batteries are done by the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers? If the US, which is 7 times our size in terms of economy, has 16 departments, the central government, why do we need 85 departments, 53 ministries? If you see how, say, electric vehicles, Ministry of Heavy Industries does the cars, Ministry of Electronics does something on the electric vehicles are electronics in a car, right? And then batteries are chemicals and fertilizers. Now we are already, I think, at least 10, 15 years behind the Chinese. We have a much lower capability of giving fiscal support. And here, the decision-making is spread across 3 ministries and therefore not very efficient. So as we get into an era of industrial policy competition, so remember that the end of multilateralism means that every single tool of industrial policy is going to be deployed by the world. So everything from weak currencies to labor subsidies to capital subsidies to directed credit, all kinds of tools will be used. The government then needs to be much leaner and much more focused on the areas, the problem areas. So when I talked about efficiency, I meant that government organization itself needs to be much more focused. Currently, it's too distributed.
Industrial policy competition. So PLI scheme is also an example of that. And now there are murmurs that, the government might not extend the scheme because in certain areas, like electric vehicles, for example, it has not seen much of a success, frankly. What do you think? Should the government actually extend the scheme? Should they tweak it because of this changing scenario where you're saying we need to use all these tools?
You must have seen that the PLI scheme on electronic components was announced today. So it is not that the government is stepping away from intervention. As I see it, many of these PLI schemes, while, see, the way I see PLI schemes, the intent was to create large manufacturers from India. And to the extent possible, attract foreign manufacturing to India, because then expertise, machinery, value chain linkages all get formed. And this is exactly where China was. And then I'd like to repeat this, that in 2004, nearly 60% of Chinese goods exports came from foreign firms manufacturing in China. You must have seen about that story of the tunnel boring machines, which the Chinese are stopping at the ports, and it's been by the German companies in China, right? So even today, 1/3 of Chinese goods exports are, so $1 trillion of goods exports from China are foreign firms manufacturing in China. So those were the objectives of the PLI scheme. What ended up happening, because while that was the intent from the top, as it went to the line ministries, it very quickly descended into, oh, you know what, we shouldn't be too selective. You know what, let's give it to 50 firms. Now, the moment you give incentives to 50 firms, it becomes too small to make them competitive in a global market. So, for example, you know, the reason that the 2,000 crore footwear scheme hasn't taken off is that the industry wanted that you know, there should be 20 crores given to 100 firms. That's not going to work. Because today, you know, the Indian firms add 10 lines, 20 lines. The Chinese and the Taiwanese don't see below 200 lines, when the assembly lines, that is. And so unless you give 200, 250 crores to 8 or 10 companies, it is not going to be effective in attracting global demand or making Indian firms efficient. So I think there are lessons to be learned. I think the decision not to renew is the right one in most cases, because the schemes themselves were not aligning to the objectives that, I think some of them were unstated objectives. Perhaps that is why there was a bit of slippage. But remember that this is, and it is also the right message that unlike some of the earlier incentives which lasted in perpetuity, that you start with an end date but you don't stop it, that makes the industry lazy. I think it's important to say that, okay, it's not working, we're going to cut it. But as the launch of the PLI for electronic components today says, that in principle, the government is still focused on it. I think the government may tweak it, take lessons from it, refine it, and then launch it again. Because you will need, I think, a lot of industrial policy action going forward.
Okay. Let's take a couple of audience questions now. Before. Yes, please.
Yeah, so it was a very insightful discussion, and you mentioned various things about the dollar. So particularly about the dollar as a reserve currency. Do we actually need the dollar as a reserve currency? Because I've been given to understand that around 60% of the trade happens in Asia, within Asia itself. Like China exporting to some other countries within Asia, Vietnam exporting within Asia, and due to the Trump tariffs and things like that, this trade, intra-Asia trade, is just bound to grow. So when we are trading right within Asia, why would we need the dollar?
You know, this transition is not going to be easy or a very short one. So you're absolutely right that the center of gravity, see, the time at which the dollar became the reserve currency of the world, say starting the mid-1930s, and then got cemented with the Bretton Woods system. And if you read the history of what really happened at Bretton Woods, you will see how contested it was, that Keynes said that, look, this is, the Americans are becoming too dominant, that everything is being linked to the dollar. And then you see how the euro-dollar market in the 1950s and 60s emerged. It is actually quite fascinating that because there were so many dollars because of that the Americans had parked outside, they had to find out mechanisms so that those dollars didn't come back, because otherwise they would have had to pay in gold. And that led to the Fed easing regulations, allowing dollar to be held by European banks. So this transition was a very well managed one. If you see Barry Eichengreen's paper on, or the book on the US dollar as a reserve currency, you will see that the transition from the sterling to the dollar was not an automatic one. Starting with its formation in about 1913-14, the Fed passed many regulations which allowed the dollar to be a lot more freely traded. People became comfortable holding the dollar, and that's when it became a reserve currency. The whole point is that you need one currency which everyone is comfortable with. Because if you think about exchange rates, because we all understand buy-sell, the spreads, so the point is maintaining, suppose there are 30 currencies in the world, maintaining liquid exchange rates for all those 30, it's NC2 problem, right? It's 29C2, 30C2. You need to maintain a very large number of liquid exchange rates. The moment you have one currency in the middle, you just have to maintain 29 liquid exchange rates, which is why economically it is very efficient to have one currency which everyone is trading against. Unless you find another alternative, it is going to be very hard to displace the dollar. So I think the process has started. It would be unwise for us to expect that the dollar will not remain a reserve currency even 5 years later. If you were asking me what would happen 15, 20 years later, I think the likelihood of reserves for many countries being in non-dollar assets or a large part of invoicing globally happening in non-dollar currencies, those probabilities will be much higher. But I think it would be unwise to expect that the dollar will be replaced as a reserve currency anytime in the next 3 to 5 years.
One final question. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely delighted to hear you, Mr. Mishra. So my question is, world's one of the biggest hedge fund manager, Mr. Ray Dalio, in its last book, The Changing World Order, he talked about the stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So 5 is more about decline and 6 is collapse. So he had made a comment regards US is in stage 5 where rising powers, and stage 6 is about flight of currency and devaluation. So if it materializes, so definitely the time span is 15, 20 years, but how it going to change and what could be the tectonic shift? Because it comes with by a guy like Ray Dalio.
See, Ray has his own worldview, but I think it's a very important question. You go back to, I briefly mentioned the 1930s, when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were imposed in 1930. In 1931, Japan broke the gold standard. 1932, I think sterling broke the gold, the UK broke the gold standard. Then 2 years later, the US broke the gold standard. And you plot the industrial production from these economies, you will see that France, which broke the gold standard the last, which is 1936-37, its output kept falling throughout the year, throughout the decade. Japan was the best because it broke the gold, so it devalued its currency. And remember that the currency movements against the dollar in that decade were 50 to 250%. So that axis itself is quite scary. So I'm apprehensive, though I'm hoping that it doesn't go down that path. I'm apprehensive that we will see similar currency devaluations, not of that magnitude, but attempts to devalue the currency in order to stay competitive, and that can create a next level of chaos. Till the time that, again, some global entity, it could be G20, it could be the post-Trump presidency, which then gets everyone together and says, you know what, guys, let's have this new world order and let's settle it. So this change is overdue. If you look back, starting with the mid-16th century, every 80 to 100 years, the world order changes because new powers emerge. They have to be given space. The existing powers don't want to do that. Some kind of tussle happens, and then a new world order. There's a big treaty, like there was a Treaty of Vienna. You must have heard about it. So all of those things lead to a reset, and that reset could be several years away. And so all I can say is that I think the period from now to then could be quite turbulent when it comes to global economics.
That's all we have time for, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Mr. Mishra.
Thank you, Ravi.